Hello, I'm Francis Smith with a doctorate in the field of craniofacial research, and I want to introduce my colleagues, and, Dr. Abigail Tucker and Dr. Paul Sharp
Dr. Karen Liu.
and Dr. Karen Liu, all at King's College London. And uh, the purpose of my interview with my colleagues is to inform and educate the public about the basics of craniofacial and science and the work that researchers like us do to better understand the, the craniofacial embryonic development and what goes wrong. And we also want to look at how our research can one day help children born with craniofacial defects and how these disorders can someday be prevented and treated. So, first of all, would you please introduce yourselves and what do you do?
I'm Professor Paul Sharp. I've been working in the general field of craniofacial developmental biology for just over 25 years now. Although I have to admit that I never intended to specifically move into this research area. In my case, it happened purely by serendipity. Many years ago, in the early days of gene cloning, I isolated a gene completely by chance that was highly specifically expressed during the development of teeth, and continued studying that gene and other genes over a number of years, and gradually changed focus from being interested in specific genes to being interested in tooth development. And that's an area I still work on today.
So I'm Professor Abigail Tucker. I've been working on craniofacial development now for 20 years. So I actually first came to work with Paul as a postdoc, and that was my first introduction to the head, and we looked at how the jaws were patterned, how teeth developed, initiated within them. And that really started me looking at all the different aspects of the head. So now I work with still looking at tooth development some of the time, also looking at gland development, and recently moving into ear development. So looking at how particularly the middle and the external ear form in the embryo.
So I'm Dr. Karen Liu, and I've been working roughly in the developmental biology field for about 20 years as well, and I've been with the Department of Craniofacial Development for 9 years. I've always been really interested in how tissues interact with each other to form complex structures, and the head, of course, is an excellent example of this, because we have to bring together bones and muscle and neural tissue and all our sensory organs together to form a functioning animal. The particular focus of my lab for the past 10 years or so has been the neural crest, and the neural crest is a specialized tissue that contributes to the craniofacial skeleton, so I've been quite interested in the patterning of the bones and the cartilage of the head structures. And more recently, we've been interested in how these structures repair themselves as well as potentially regenerate in the long term. And so we basically, our interests range from diseases and disorders that arise in the embryo all the way through to maintenance in adults.
Thank you. And what do you each consider your most important finding to date, in summary?
That's a difficult question. I tend not to think that, because I think everything we do is important, because it's adding to the knowledge.
Yes.
And what I consider at the time to be significant when we do something, often others don't see it that way, and sometimes things that I think are interesting but not massively significant turn out to to be so. So I think it's a very difficult thing, and I tend to think of the whole of biology as an accumulation of lots of small and often either significant or insignificant findings that, when put together, actually produce the whole story. So I've not answered the question, but I don't think I can.
You're making it difficult for us. Yeah. I think when I was working on tooth development with Paul, I think we were looking at how you actually sort of get a shape of a tooth. So why does an incisor look like an incisor? Why does a molar look like a molar? And I think we did some really sort of groundbreaking stuff at actually working out how that kind of pattern is set up. So it's been very nice watching how that work has progressed and how other labs have gone off and extended your work.
Right.
And actually, one of the great things is when you do have a discovery and people follow it up. That's really what you want to see happening.
That's
that
right.
it
Absolutely.
becomes sort of integrated into the general knowledge, and people use that information to find new endeavors. I mean, I've moved now mostly, as I said, to the ear, and one of the reasons is that I find it's really understudied. And I just find there's so many fascinating questions out there, and so it's just a sort of a hole that is sitting there, and so that for me that's really exciting, and I'm trying to sort of work out what's going on.
So one of the most exciting things we've been thinking about the last few years are two particular craniofacial anomalies. One is craniosynostosis, which is a premature fusion of the skull bones, and the other is a disorder called ciliopathy, which is a very broad-ranging disorder that can affect many different tissue organs. In the craniofacial skeleton, one of the major organs that is affected is the skull as well. And so we recently discovered that there were some signals that were in common between these two anomalies, which gives us some insight into how these things might occur in the embryo due to some of the genetic lesions that might occur in the germline. And so that's something that we found very surprising, and I think perhaps the field finds very surprising, and I'm hoping that in the future it tells us a bit more about what the key signals are. And that, like Abby says, if someone should follow this up further, more in depth, basically, or in the clinic, that would be very exciting.
Is genetics important in your areas of research, and how?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's extremely important. We're looking at what the genes are doing. So often you know that a gene perhaps leads to a defect. So you can say, okay, for example, with your Treacher-Collins, we know it's the TCOF gene, and then it's going that little bit further and saying, okay, we know it's that gene, but what is that gene doing? Why does that gene actually cause that defect? And sort of linking up the mechanisms behind the genetics.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think for me, genetics sort of falls into two different aspects. One is actually applying genetic tools. So we can make a mouse that's got a particular genetic defect by mutating a gene in various ways to try and reproduce what you might see in a human birth defect, a human craniofacial abnormality. So that's using genetics as an experimental tool in animals. In the human side, we can now identify mutated genes or altered genes that cause particular malformations of any kind very, very quickly. And we're doing an increasing amount of that with tooth disorders, dental problems, extra teeth, missing teeth. You get a number of patients in the clinics, and with a little bit of work that's not too difficult these days, you can identify the causative genes. And that then leads you on to doing the kind of studies that Abby talked about. You have the gene, okay, so when it's mutated, how does it give rise to this abnormality? What are the molecular and cellular processes that give rise to that?
Yeah. I agree with that. I too think that one of the key questions we need to be asking is what are the genes that are important, and how do we find new genes? And the search for new genes is becoming really efficient, and our role in this is to bring those new genes from the clinic back to the bench and then back again to the clinic. For us, actually, I think, and again, with something like TCOF, you're well aware of this, that sometimes you get one gene mutation and the outcome is very different for different people. And so we're quite curious as to why that is as well. And that's something, hopefully in the near term, we will develop a better understanding for what these genes are doing in different contexts.
Thank you. And so I gather that genetics is the main foundational building block for our science.
It
Very,
is,
yeah. I mean,
it
for
is.
our area, a
For
very
our
important
area,
one.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Are genetic errors important in abnormal craniofacial development?
Yes, I mean, we have lots of mouse models where we have genetic mutations that are the same as found in patients, and they have the same kind of disorders. So we can really follow up how does a mutation in a gene lead to a craniofacial disorder.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we do at the moment, although we have these new powerful tools, is still pretty crude. So if you have an obvious malformation, you can identify the gene, and the genes are usually in that malformation. There's mutations in those genes that alter the protein, and that's why you get the changes in craniofacial development. And that's obvious. So I think what is very interesting and what's going to be important in the coming years are changes in craniofacial development that are caused by mutations that are not in the coding sequences of the genes. Mutations that control the timing of gene expression and the level of gene expression. And that is, after all, why we have our particular facial features. On the whole, unless we have a major abnormality, we all look very similar. We all have a human face, but all our faces are very different. And that is because we all have subtle differences in the timing and the level of all these different genes that can control craniofacial form. And I think understanding that is going to be really interesting, including the epigenome side of that, how the importance of epigenetics in controlling normal facial development.
So I think the other interesting thing about craniofacial development is also that because it's such an important structure, and because it gives us all of our special appearances, small changes in genes can actually give us large changes in the head structures. So a lot of the disorders that we study are probably single gene disorders, and so the identification of these new genes is very important. It's a bit more complex when you get to a disorder like diabetes, which is probably a complex genetic disorder.
Besides genetics, what other factors are involved in causing craniofacial malformations?
Well, I mean, there's quite a few disorders, things like cleft palates, where we know it's very multifactorial. You've got the two extremes where you can have something that is just completely genetic, so you can say if you have a mutation in this gene in this area, you have a cleft palate. But it goes all the way to purely environmental. And on the way, there's lots of cases where a genetic disorder can predispose you to being more vulnerable. So that if you have perhaps nutritional problems, or if there's smoking, alcohol involved, that can just sort of push you over the edge.
I think it's a combination of everything. Genes underpin everything. and you can get various environmental insults, as Abby just alluded to, and many of those can affect the genome in different ways, both in terms of direct modifications, direct mutations, or indirect epigenome modifications.
And there are situations certainly where it's not all influences on the genes. For example, in craniosynostosis, if you have inappropriate pressure on the skull, you can get craniosynostosis. And that doesn't necessarily require any change in the genetic complement. But again, it's often the combination of factors that influences the frequency, the susceptibility to a particular disorder.
Another environmental factor I found recently involved in craniofacial malformations is the lack of oxygen
Yes.
during early development, and that may or may not interact with the genes. We don't know yet.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's a very good example.
Yeah, that's yes.
You all are mainly involved in basic research, is that correct?
Yes, I think Karen here has probably the strongest links to clinicians, but we all have links with clinicians, because I think it's really key that the questions that we're trying to answer are the clinically relevant questions. And so it's great to talk to a clinician and say, when you go into the clinic, what are the problems you see? What do you want to know the answer to? And then we can go back to the basic research and try and answer those things.
So how much interaction do you have with clinicians?
I think it varies. So I know Abby has very close, and both of you have very close and specific interactions. My interaction's a bit more general, including identifying clinicians that are seeing children in the orthodontics clinics that might have abnormal teeth patterns, and then getting them to contact us and saying we've got these, this family or whatever. So they're sort of general interactions, but there are.
We also have students and researchers who visit the department or visit our labs, and that actually is often very fruitful, I think. I think Paul has some clinicians who are doing PhDs.
Yeah, increasingly the majority of my PhD students are
yeah.
clinicians.
And then Abby's students are some of them co-supervised by clinicians as well, so that actually is very, very useful, I think, and very important for defining our questions.
Yeah, and our department is just a sort of set up so that we can have honorary contracts with clinicians, so that clinicians, we're not only working with them, we can actually say, you're part of the department, come, we'll come and see you, but you can come and see us, and we can sit around the table, and we're now all part of the same department.
Well, I myself have a very strong interest in ecumenical interactions between science and clinicians, and I am interested how do you think we could better integrate the two sides?
Well, I think doing things like making them part of the department, giving them honorary contracts, is great, because that really is sort of bringing people in, saying, yeah, we want to talk to you, and they get something out of it at the same time. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In my lab, I have actually 4 clinicians who are doing PhDs, and they are helping to shape the problems because of their own personal clinical research interests. And we're trying to we're looking, I think, in the long term to make use of that to basically have access to patients as well as to allow patients to have access to a better understanding of the basic research that occurs, and how we might use this to identify new genes or to improve the treatments that they might get in the long term.
And to sort of encourage clinicians to do PhDs,
Yes.
And particularly, come and do a PhD in craniofacial development, to put in place PhD programs that are attractive to clinicians, so that they can see the benefit of coming and actually learning the basic research and working with us.
A lot of this, I think, is driven by new technology as well, because as Paul mentioned, the sequencing these days is much easier, so we can more easily identify gene mutations, or we can identify changes in the way the genes are expressed or the proteins work. So this allows us to actually become a lot more personalized with understanding the various disorders, and then especially in the context of genes that have different outcomes in different patients. This will also help us understand that.
Yeah.
I'm also interested in someday having opportunities for clinicians and scientists to attend each other's conferences or trainings or workshops, so we can learn from each other about the advances on either side.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's a
absolutely.
very good idea.
What are the chances that craniofacial disorders can be prevented?
I think the environmental insults is certainly a lot of possibilities there. You mentioned hypoxia. If you can really get some information about how that affects craniofacial development, along with all the other kind of environmental insults, there are clearly things you can do something about via education as much as anything else. Pure genetic directed malformations is much more difficult for many cases, because you're talking about in utero surgery or other kinds of treatments, which have their problems.
Right. I think genetic counseling is quite important, but that means that we need to know what the causative genes are, and for many disorders we don't yet know the causative genes, so that can be quite difficult. I think we're a long way off from prevention.
Yeah, I mean, they've recently announced they were doing the clinical trials of giving newborn babies an EDA pathway stimulant, and that was trying to correct tooth development, gland development in newborns with hyperhidrotic ectodermal dysplasia, and unfortunately in that case it doesn't seem to actually have worked. So occasionally there are these chances to try new preventative measures. I think there are lots of very good scientific reasons why it might not have worked, dose, timing, and I think people have just got to keep on going. You've just got to go, okay, let's not give up on that, we'll keep on going, come up with a new therapy.
I think we also need the clinicians to have a good understanding of the basic research, because if they have a clear understanding of the molecular underpinnings of the disorder, then they may have a better chance of designing a therapeutic in the long term. So that's, again, like you said, bringing the clinicians to us and back again. It's very important.
How do you think genomics and personalized medicine are changing the field in general, as well as your own approaches to the field?
Well, it's an interesting question. In terms of dentistry, I always tell people that dentistry is always personalised, and it is completely personalised. Every individual patient gets unique treatment because every individual's teeth are completely different. And that's not been the case with medicine. Medicine has been much more generic. You have something wrong with you, you prescribe the particular drug that is for that disease. But of course that's changing, and medicine is becoming more personal, and with the advances in genomics will undoubtedly lead to much more personal medicine. Whether that's specific drugs for specific patients remains to be seen. But I certainly think the where there are alternative drugs delivered in alternative ways, that's the way that I think that can change things. Where that's what really personalised medicine means. At least I think it's going to be in its first iteration.
Yeah.
What are the scientific and other challenges that you face as researchers in making further advances?
Well, I think there's always the general challenge of getting funding. Funding is out there. It's a question of coming up with new, great research ideas that are really backed up by the science, but it takes a lot of effort to actually write a grant proposal. So that's a lot of your time is spent sitting there thinking about money. It would be quite nice if we didn't have to, as lab heads, think about money almost sort of every day. You sort of have it at the back of your head that where's the next bit of money coming from for your research.
I agree. I think the biggest challenge is that politicians are increasingly getting more and more involved in determining where research funding should be invested, rather than the scientists themselves peer reviewing and deciding what's important. Politicians are saying, well, this is more important than that, so you fund this rather than that, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Politicians aren't scientists or clinicians on the whole. They have advisors, but I think many of the advisors are so politically orientated these days that we feel we are increasingly being told what we should work on and what's important, and that's not necessarily correct.
I think that following up on that, there is quite a bit of emphasis on producing a clinical outcome or a clinical therapy directly from one's research, and using that kind of approach, we would have had very little chance of understanding, for example, TCOF1, how this molecule actually works and what actually happens in the embryo during development, because that would not have that body of work, which is clearly quite important, would not have been considered a significant output from a funding agency's perspective. And so, while one could argue that's not necessarily led to a treatment, at least a better understanding will certainly help us with our long-term strategy for dealing with these kinds of disorders. And it's something that's really, really important, I think, for understanding clinical disorders. So I think we need to be careful that our work is not pushed entirely towards delivering something to the clinic immediately, that we need to make sure we have a clear understanding of the biology that underlies the disorders.
I know from my own research and reading others that we often have to put in a statement of future clinical implications so often
Yes.
in our papers.
Yes. And I think they don't appreciate the full importance, perhaps, of providing patients with an understanding of their disorder, and that this actually is a clear
benefit yeah.
of our work, right? And that many patients, I believe, are grateful for this kind of insight, which, they want to know why. Like, of course they want to fix it, but they also want to know why.
We have to strike a balance between describing the basic science as well as describing future implications
Yes,
of it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Where do you see breakthroughs occurring in future in our field?
I think we will, with a lot of the new technology, with the next generation sequencing methods, for example, you can start coming up with huge amounts of genetic information. You can compare lots of different tissues, stages of development, normal, abnormal tissue, and you will end up having this enormous database of information. And so I think that bioinformatics is going to be becoming more and more important, because what you do with this, you do some sort of a RNA-seq, and you come out with 10,000 genes on your list, and then you actually have to make sense of that and say what is important, what are the key changes in this sort of sea of change that goes on. And I think that's going to be a really big area for the future, trying to sort out all that data that's going to be arriving.
Yeah, I think one of the breakthroughs is going to be things that come out of tissue engineering or regeneration, where you can improve tissue repair, for example, either endogenously or by adding cells back in. I mean, it's a huge area, and in some respects, certain aspects of it have been around a long time, trying to improve fracture healing and things like this. And we hope breakthroughs will appear soon. I wouldn't say there've been any major ones so far, but I think they will come. And I hope that when those things come, that they are based on simple applications of complicated biology. Biology is incredibly complicated, and that's the problem when you need to apply it clinically, because you realistically can't do complicated things very well, because they're difficult and they're also very expensive. And so I think the challenge is, and where the breakthroughs are going to come, where people take complicated biology, whether it's craniofacial development or anything else. Craniofacial development is a good example because it really is complicated, but develop simple approaches to improve things, to improve development, abnormalities or repair.
I would tend to agree. I don't have too much to add, other than I think that the major challenge is sorting through all of this massive bioinformatic data, and then actually using that to identify the key basic factors, which is, there's definitely an hourglass thing to it. It's a huge amounts of data to actually forcing your own cells to repair themselves. It's going to be seriously challenging. But I do think it's clear that we're pushing towards combining engineering principles with biological principles, and we're going to be able to start to do things like combining scaffolds with cells, and then persuading the patient's own cells to do the right thing. Right, like right now, reconstructing the skeleton of the jaw, these are almost impossible tasks to do properly. Right, if we could improve that even a little bit, that would be amazing.
I think you want to rely as heavily as possibly on nature,
Yes.
Because nature knows how to do it,
Yeah.
and you just got to get the starting position right. For example, if you're going to convince a patient's cells to actually go and do the job themselves,
Right.
then all you need is that sort of stimulation,
Yeah.
and then you want it to go ahead on
And
its
you want
own.
it to stop at the right time, and you want it's complicated. But then, from the various disorders that we study, we have, people with bones that ossify too much and people with bones that don't ossify enough, right? So somewhere in between there's a balance. And so if we can persuade the body to mimic a particular condition briefly, then that would be amazing,
Yeah.
I think.
In my current postdoctoral training, I am in the forefront of informatics, and I have the challenge of what is basically a fishing expedition, and I have to decide which fish or genes are more important to keep and throw back the others.
Yeah.
That is my current challenge, and for the foreseeable future in my current
Yeah.
training.
Yeah, absolutely.
Eventually, we will come up with a way to determine which of the fish or genes is most important
Mhm.
to the study.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
At this present time, what can be done for affected children and their families medically and socially and otherwise?
No, I think a lot of the families do like to be involved in the research, to know what's happening. I think it would be great if there, from a consent point of view, if everybody, every patient coming into the hospital, any patient with a craniofacial disorder, that they could be involved in research, so that as they come through the door, right from that point, they're involved in the whole system. And I think if you can improve the communication between basic researchers and families, that would be great, because I think the families want to know, and in many cases the information is there, and at the same time the basic researchers can benefit from the wealth of information that the families have.
I think in general, medically, everything, and at least in the specialised centres, is done that can be done with what we know so far. I think the big thing is probably public awareness, which is always a difficult thing, especially with facial malformations, because they're the most evocative of all of the bodily malformations, because it's your face basically. It's what we use to recognise each individual, and we all naturally have a view of what is a normal face, and when we see something abnormal, that provokes reactions in people, and I think the more public awareness, and also again going back to politicians and governments, the more they all talk about hearts and cardiovascular and neurological disorders and all these other really important disorders, but there's never really a focus on craniofacial abnormalities and the impact that they have. The patients are, after all, on the whole, alive, and as well as they can be. And they sort of say, well, that's all right, But as you know yourself, there is another side to that, and there is a huge impact socially with respect to these abnormalities.
Especially in the school years.
I can imagine, yeah.
Yeah.
These craniofacial anomalies in a student can attract bullying from classmates and discrimination from school teachers and head teachers, and later on in potential employers.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I just think just making aware that in many cases this these things occur completely at random. It's a randomly occurring gene mutation that nobody could do anything about in many cases, apart from the obvious environmental things. And I suspect the general public don't even know.
Although in my native United States of America, there are initiatives in some of the schools to raise awareness of students with craniofacial anomalies and teach other classmates about these disorders.
Yeah, I agree. I think actually, so some of the television programs, for example, I think are quite well done as well. Like they had one about cherubism a few years back, which was quite well done. They featured some patients, and this really, I think, improved the public understanding of the causes, as well as not preventing fear and misunderstanding. So I definitely think that's something we should be improving quite a bit. I know a lot of patients also are quite keen to feel like they're part of something. So sometimes I'm sure you've all gotten emails sometimes from patients who are curious about the current status of research. And so that's something I think we can work on as well, to provide a bit better understanding of the limitations, but also the exciting new things that come out. So.
Another issue I face in my own country, the United States, is the resistance of the medical insurance
Oh, my
industry
goodness.
to covering surgeries,
Yeah.
hearing aids, and other necessary treatments of craniofacial anomalies.
Mhm.
How is that issue here in the UK?
I think in the UK it's much better.
Yeah, we have a national
We-
health service.
Yes, I don't think this is
and,
a serious
you know, for all its
concern.
faults, they're
Yeah.
very good at that kind of
Yes.
thing.
Yeah,
You know, if,
Yes.
for example, even something like orthodontics, if you have, a genetic malformation that requires major manipulation of your growing teeth, then you get free orthodontic care,
Yes,
for example, and that's, the tip of the iceberg.
yes,
But with hearing aids, if you need a hearing aid, you get a hearing aid. It's free. It's So
in the United States, the insurance companies will fight tooth and nail to avoid covering hearing aids, as I have found from my own experience, among other treatments I needed.
Yeah.
It takes an act of Congress to get insurance to cover anything.
yeah.
Yes.
But
Yes,
I admire what your NHS is trying to do.
yes, I think that's definitely better here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And finally, what do you foresee in terms of raising awareness, detection, prevention, and treatment of craniofacial anomalies in future?
Well, going back to basic research, the more we know, the more we can do.
Yes.
The more we know about the genes, environmental insults, how everything works, the more you can do in all those things in terms of awareness, detection, treatment, everything. I think it really is one area, does all come back to basic research and understanding.
Yes. Knowing the genes actually does not help us very much. We need to know what the genes are doing. That's something I think that needs to be made very clear to the general public and to the funders as well. That just the sheer identification of the gene is not sufficient. But we're moving in that direction. And as we already noted, the masses, and as you've noted, the masses of information we're getting, if we sift through them well and put it together and understand what they're doing, that will be amazing.
And I have to say, I'm very sort of excited about continuing in craniofacial research because I think it is such a fascinating area. I love the fact that it's such a complex structure and trying to sort of work out all the interactions that go on. So I'm really looking forward to the sort of the changes that are going on, driving forward craniofacial research.
The field is moving tremendously fast. So.
It is, but the word of caution is that the funding for this research is dipping very, very quickly. There's this crazy perception that whoever it is thinks, well, you know all this stuff already, really, and we do know a lot. We don't know anything like enough, but the perception is we do. You know all this already. You know all about the signaling pathways and everything else. So what you've now got to do is develop treatments, and it's not the case. And so the basic developmental biology in general, at least in the UK, the funding has seen a dramatic decrease for those kind of studies, for those kind of reasons. And I think the biggest challenge we're going to have is try and readdress that and say, hang on, we clearly don't know enough by a long way. And you can't take this approach.
We face the same battles with decreased funding in our own United States government.
Absolutely.
And obviously I'm interested in advances in craniofacial basic science, and I am also interested in seeing the advances in less invasive reconstructive surgery techniques and more a smaller, more efficient, implantable bone convection hearing aids, for example, and countless other advances yet to come in treatment.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with that.
I want to thank all of you as my colleagues from King's College London, Dr. Abigail Tucker, Dr. Paul Sharp, and Dr. Karen Liu, for taking your time to talk with me today about the advances and benefits of craniofacial research.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks for coming, Francis.
Yeah.